Thank you, Ken, for these kind words. I'm very honored to be here today. I would first like to apologize for the fact that my English sounds a lot like French, and I hope, at least for those of you who know some French or who want to learn about French, this might be an advantage. I hope others will still understand what I have to say. So in this lecture, I'm going to present a number of results and thoughts which are exposed in my book, Capital in the 21st Century. So let me also apologize that, for writing such a long book, and, I hope it will be shorter. But on the other hand, there are reasons why it is long. And the main reason is that I try to put together in this book a lot of historical material. So this is, now that the book has been successful and that you are here, I can tell you the truth. I have very little to say about the 21st century. And this book is mostly about the past. And I am much better at talking about the past than talking about the future. And so what I do for the most part in this book is to put together a lot of historical data on income and wealth, which had never been collected before, largely for bad reason. I think a lot of this historical data was sitting there but was not collected because it looked too historical for economists who sometimes tend to focus on the past 10 years or past 10 months or past 10 minutes and don't want to look at the long run. And this was, and also probably many historians thought it was too economic for them. So in the end, nobody was really using this historical fiscal data on income and wealth that we have put together. The other reason why this was not done before is simply that it is much easier today with modern information technologies to collect data on such a grand scale. And so, we are just benefiting from better technologies. I want to stress that we still know too little about inequality dynamics. So we know a little bit more than we used to, but we still know far too little. So all the interpretations that I propose in this book regarding the evolution, are subject to discussion, and I welcome all discussion. So the objective of this book is not to say, this is the only way to interpret the evidence, but rather to help people to make their own opinion about these very complicated issues that we have to face in our democratic societies. So let me thank also, all the people who have helped to collect the data. I was very fortunate after I started to work on the history of inequality about 15 years ago. I was very fortunate to find many co-authors and collaborators. Emmanuel Saez, in particular, who teaches at Berkeley. Tony Atkinson, who is maybe the godfather, together with Simon Kuznets, of all historical studies on inequality. And in many ways, all what we've been doing is to pursue this work of Kuznets and Atkinson to a broader scale. I cannot refer to every people, but there are more than 30 scholars who have contributed to this database, and this is still continuing. The general objective is to put distribution back at the center of political economy, and also the study of the long run at the center of political economy. And so today I will present a number of selected evolution. I cannot present everything. If you want to have a better sense of the material that is covered in the book, please have a look at this web page or at the World Top Income Database website, where we permanently put online new series from other countries. One of the positive impacts of the book has been to open up fiscal data in more countries, in particular in a number of emerging countries, in Brazil, in Mexico, and there are in Korea, in Taiwan. There are many countries which are not covered in the book just because we could not access the data, and one of the positive impacts of the book is that we have now access to more data. So you can, if you look at this website, you will see, all the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are about to enter the database. So what it means to be in the database is that we try to collect all the historical data on income that we could find, which usually the oldest source of information about income comes from the income tax. So the income tax, federal income tax in the United States was created in 1913, in 1914 in France. In 1908, the income tax became progressive in Britain. In Germany, Japan, it was a bit before, around 1890, 1900. In some countries, it was closer to 1920. Well, usually we can return to the beginning of the 20th century. This is a data source that is not perfect, but it's better than no data at all. The first economist to use this data from an historical perspective was Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. So Simon Kuznets was a US economist, a Ukrainian-born US economist, who first produced the first national accounts for the US. And then in the early 1950s, his next task was to use for the first time this income tax data between 1913 and 1948 to compute the evolution of the share of national income going to the top 10%, the bottom 50%, the bottom 90% of the distribution. So this was the natural next step after you are able to measure GDP growth, the total growth of national income of the country. You want to know how the different social groups are benefiting from growth. And Kuznets came with very good news, which was a decline in inequality in the US between 1913 and 1948. Kuznets himself was very cautious about the interpretation, and he knew, when you read this book, he knew that this had a lot to do with the particular historical events of this period, the Great Depression, World War II, New Deal policies. But in the Cold War context of the 50s, 60s, many people wanted to believe in a more optimistic and universal story, which was very often referred to as the Kuznets curve, according to which you have a natural tendency for a decline in inequality in the advanced stages of development. Kuznets himself did not believe too much in this Kuznets curve, but this was very popular partly for political reasons. In the Cold War, it was a very powerful political message to send, in particular, to developing countries and to newly independent countries. Please just wait. Be quiet. At some point, please don't become communist. At some point, you will have a reduction of inequality together with growth. You just need to wait. Now, what we've done with Emmanuel Saez, Tony Atkinson, and many other collaborators is simply to extend this to many more countries. So Kuznets had only one country, basically the US, for 35 years, which was already a lot more than before. In the 19th century, economists were talking about inequality, Ricardo, Marx, everybody was talking about inequality, but they had no data to measure income inequality, which puts strong limitations to what you can say, or actually it puts no limit to what you can say, which is even worse. And so at least Kuznets had a real statistical material, and again, all what we've done is to benefit from modern technology to do the same for many more countries. And our next step was then to work on wealth, for which we have data sources which are sometimes even older than for income. In some cases, we are for Britain and France, we are able to return to the 18th century, or at least to the early 19th century, because the registration of wealth and property rights, in particular at the time of family transmission of wealth, at the time of inheritance, is much older than the taxation of income. So we have older data sources on wealth for a number of countries. So today I'm going to show you a number of results. I'm going to try to make 3 points in this presentation. First point about income, and second and third point about wealth. So first point, I will talk about the long-run dynamics of income inequality, the end of the sort of Kuznets curve optimist theory of a natural deterministic decline in inequality in the long run, and the main conclusion, which will be that there are powerful forces potentially going in both directions, reducing and rising inequality. And in the end, it's really the institution and the policies that determine which forces are going to prevail. Institution and policy in a broad variety of domain, education, labor, tax, and I will come back to this in a minute. And then second point will be about the long-run evolution of the aggregate value of private wealth relative to income, and third point about the inequality and concentration of wealth. And these are two different dimensions which are partly related but not completely. You can have a very large aggregate value of private wealth and a very egalitarian distribution if everybody has an equal share in some gigantic pension fund or equal share in the housing stock. So that's really different from the issue of inequality, so it needs to be distinguished. So let me start with the first issue about the long-run dynamics of income inequality. So I'm going to show you three simple facts about inequality in the long run during this presentation. One about income inequality, the other one with wealth inequality, the other one with wealth-income ratio. If you want to see a very short presentation of these three facts, look at this article that we published in Science with Emmanuel Saez in 2014. You know, the good thing about Science is that you have to be very short. So that's a 5-page article. So at least, you know, if you don't want to read the book, you can read this 5-page long article. You will get, you know, not most of it, but you will get a big part of it. So fact number one about income inequality is that we have a reversal in the comparison in income inequality between the US and Europe in the long run. So a century ago, there was more income inequality in Europe than in the US, and today it's the opposite. So one simple curve to summarize this evolution. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So you can see the decline in inequality between 1910 and 1950. So this is what Kuznets found for the US, you know, and you know, we redid the computation, and Kuznets was right. You know, he didn't have Excel, he did everything by hand, but this was right. Now we did it for other countries. So when I say Europe here, this is the GDP weighted average of Germany, Britain, France, Sweden, Italy. So this is not exactly Europe, but it's a big part of Western Europe, and you have similar evolution, relatively similar evolution in these different European countries in the long run. So I think it makes sense to just take a European average and compare to the US. Now in the more recent period, you can see that you have an increase in inequality everywhere, but it is much stronger in the US than in Europe. Okay, so you know, the orders of magnitude that you should remember is that the share of total income going to the top 10% is typically between 30 and 50%, say between 1/3 and 1/2. And so the US, it used to be 1/3 in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it is now closer to 1/2. Okay? There are some countries in the world where it's a bit more than 1/2, like in Brazil or South Africa, it could be 60% for the top 10%. These are the orders of magnitude to remember for the inequality of income. As we will see in a minute, the concentration of wealth is always a lot larger. So the share going to the top 10% of the wealth distribution is always higher than 50% and can be as high as 90%. So you know, there's really an order of magnitude between the concentration of income and wealth, and that's part of what we want to understand, because it's not obvious in any way why it should be so. To show you another version of the US evolution, so this is the annual series as compared to the decennial averages. Okay, so in this presentation, I will sometimes show you decennial averages, which are nice in order to focus on very long-run evolution. But the annual series are also interesting because, you know, life is chaotic in the short run, and the short run is important. So both perspectives on the world are important. So you can see in the short run, in particular, you have stock market bubble, stock market crash, and you can see at the end of the period that this matters a lot, in particular if you include capital gains. Okay, so the black series include capital gains, you know, the income from selling assets and in particular equity, and the curve below does not include capital gains. So you can see in 2001, 2002, this is not a good time to get big capital gains. In 2008, 2009, this is not a good time either. But in the end, in 2012, you are back to the level of inequality, which is the same or even a bit higher than 2007 prior to the financial crisis, which itself was a bit higher than 1928, which was the previous high point on this graph. Okay? So what do we learn from this evolution? Well, of course, many people looking at this series, in particular the very high point of inequality in 1928 and 2007, thought, well, maybe rising inequality is not so good for financial stability and contributed in the end to the financial crash. I think it's more complicated than that in the sense that, basically, I think modern financial systems are sufficiently fragile to crash by themselves, even without rising inequality. So I think this is partly the fact that you have this big increase in inequality prior to the crash is partly a correlation more than a causality. When you have a booming stock market, this is at the same time potentially creating financial fragility, and this is also increasing the income shares at the very top who rely more on capital gains and dividends than the poorer income group. Now, it's partly a correlation. I think there's also probably a negative extra impact of inequality, and I think many people in the US now agree that this huge increase in the share of national income going to the top 10%, and particularly a big part of this evolution is due to the top 1%, but not only, that this big increase in inequality has contributed not only to the stagnation of median household income, and probably also to the increase in household debt over this period, as bottom income groups were trying to keep up in terms of consumption, access to real estate property, in spite of their stagnant incomes. But many people also agree that this has probably contributed also to fragilize the financial system, to put strong pressure on the financial system, with some groups making a lot of money and recycling it through the financial system and lending it to lower groups. So this was really asking a lot to the financial system, and probably too much, particularly in the context of extreme financial deregulation. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on the long-run evolution, so I will not talk too much about this short-run aspect and financial crisis, but I'd be, of course, happy to respond to questions after that. So returning to the long-run evolution, you can see that there's a big difference between Europe and the US. The rise in inequality has been much bigger in the US. So in Europe, you go from 30 to 35% of income going to the top 10%. That's much less spectacular. If you look at Japan, which is the other part of the rich world with Western Europe and the US, you can see that it's in between Europe and the US, and closer to Europe in some ways. So to summarize, you have rising share of income going to the top 10% everywhere in rich countries in the recent decades, but with different magnitude. So how do we explain this? So I think it's important to stress that there is really several factors which have contributed to this increase. And first of all, it's important to stress that the rise in US inequality in recent decades is mostly due to rising inequality of labor income. So rising inequality of wealth and capital income is starting now to play a bigger and bigger role, and there's some recent research by Saez and Zuckman which is showing this very clearly. But for the most part, until now, this has been the rising inequality of labor income which has played a role. Now, this is due to a mixture of reasons. The standard economic explanation for rising inequality is the race between education and technology. So you have a race between the supply and the demand for skills. And now, if you have very fast technological progress and not sufficiently fast increasing supply of skills, then this is going to increase the skill premium. In addition, if you have an extra supply of low-skilled labor in the world coming from emerging countries, in particular coming from China over this period, then this is going to depress middle skill and low-skill wages in rich countries, and this is why you have rising inequality. Now, the problem with this story, I think this is part of what has been happening. The problem with this story is that this is not enough to explain the large international variation that we see. So, because globalization happened not only in the US, but also in Sweden, in Germany, in Japan, in France. So, it's an explanation which does not really address this large international variation. So in addition to this story based on globalization, I think it's important to have another of additional explanatory factors stressing different institutions and different policies between countries. So let me make a list of these factors. More unequal supply of skills in the US, partly due to rising tuition fees and insufficient public investment in higher education, can be part of the explanation. So if you have more unequal supply of skills with a lot of skill at the top end in top universities such as Stanford. But if the bottom 50% of the population in the US, does not really have access to the same kind of skills, and if you have a huge gap between these different groups, bigger than in Europe or in Japan, this can contribute to explain why you have more strongly rising inequality in the US. And I think that's part of the explanation. Now, you also have another issue, which is an unprecedented rise in top managerial compensation, particularly in the US, which is very difficult to explain simply on the basis of education or skills. Okay? When you observe well, when you observe top managerial compensation in the financial sector or sometimes non-financial sector going from $1 million to $10 million per year, do you get the kind of extra performance, productivity, job creation that you would expect? I could not find it in the data that we have used. But maybe with better data we'll find it. But at this stage, I think it has more to do. I think it has little to do with a competitive market with full information where everybody is paid his marginal product. I think it has more to do with bargaining power, a lot of imperfect information, and in some cases it has more to do with the ability of top managers to put the right people in the right compensation committee. And I think change in corporate governance structure, change also in the income tax progressivity, which used to be the most progressive in the world in the US until 1980, and that has become the least progressive in the world, can explain why changing attitudes toward a very high managerial compensation has been particularly dramatic, particularly extreme in the US as compared to other countries. Labor market institutions, in particular falling minimum wage in the US, declining role of unions certainly played a role. Whatever the combination of these different factors, education, corporate governance, progressive taxation, minimum wage, labor market, the general conclusion is that institutions and policy matter. And so of course you have globalization, this is very good for emerging countries. This is putting pressure on the lower skilled groups in the north. But different policies can make a difference. So depending on the set of policies you adopt, different countries can allow broader groups in their population to benefit more from globalization. So there are different possible trajectories that can be followed. So just to follow up on this, let me show you one example about minimum wage and one example about unequal access to education. So this is the evolution of the minimum wage in France and the US. So you can see today the minimum wage is higher in France. It used to be much higher in the US in the 1960s. So this is all expressed in dollars or euros of today. So you can see when you have the decline in the US like during the 1980s, this is because of inflation. So this is because you have a fixed nominal minimum wage, and year after year you have 2, 3, 4% inflation that's decreasing the real value of the minimum wage. So that in the end, so you remember President Obama earlier this year proposed to increase the federal minimum wage from $7.2 per hour today to $10 per hour. Now, if this was to happen, well, probably this is not going to happen anytime soon at the federal level, but if this was to happen, this would simply be back to the 1960s, okay, which was the level of the federal minimum wage in this country. In 1960, it was a bit more than $10 per hour in dollars of today. So that's quite unusual for a country to have an absolute decline of about 30% of the real value of its minimum wage in the course of half a century. And at that time, back in the 60s, the employment rate was 95%. So, of course, it was not the same country in terms of total size of the population, total size of the labor force. So, it's not, many things have changed. But still, it's hard to believe that the level of the minimum wage in the US today could not be increased. Regarding the French level, some people will say that it's too high. I think it has more to do with the level of payroll tax that comes on the top of the minimum wage, but that's another issue. In any case, whatever you believe about the optimal level of the minimum wage, you can see that different policy evolution can make a difference, can make a huge difference over time. Now, regarding unequal access to education, I want to show you this graph because this is a very interesting work coming from work by Emmanuel Saez, who's at Berkeley, and from Raj Shetty, who is joining Stanford, I understand, economics department this year or next year, I don't know, anytime soon. And this is very interesting work where Emmanuel and Raj were able to link up the income tax return of the parents with the social security number of the students so that you can see, depending on the parental income rank, who's going to college or not. And what's quite striking is that, okay, you get a straight line, and it's almost the first diagonal. It's almost as if you were going from a probability 0% to go to college when your parents are poor to 100% when your parents are rich. Well, it's not exactly 0 to 100. You have a 20% probability to go to college when your parents are poor, and you have only a 90% probability when your parents are rich. But still, it's quite striking. And of course, the kind of colleges and universities you go to when you're at the top are not the same than the one you go when you're at the bottom. In my book, I give some data showing that the average income of the parents of Harvard University students right now corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income, which doesn't mean that there is no student from below the top 2, but it means something very precise. It means that there are so few students from below the top 2, and that those in the top 2 are so much high up in the top 2 that the overall average is as if students had been picked at random in the top 2. So, I know that you've not been picked at random in the top 2, that this doesn't work this way, but I'm just saying, the outcome is like this, okay? So I think when you see this kind of graph, even if you forget about the Harvard or Stanford and take a broader look at the entire population, I think this is an example where, the gap between the official meritocratic discourse about equal opportunity and the reality is particularly striking. And I think, the level of hypocrisy that we see sometimes when we talk about equal opportunity is very striking. Not only in the US, I should say, it's like this, you have a lot of hypocrisy in every country. In my country, in France, where the government sometimes puts 3 times more money per student in the most privileged schools than is putting in the basic university tracks where the more disadvantaged students tend to go to. So, in every country, there's a lot of mythology about meritocracy, and sometimes with very little attention to the fact and to the data. So I think it's important to put these claims about meritocracy and equal opportunity under public scrutiny and to look at this data. And so sometimes universities, they don't want us to look at their admission procedure and how it works and what are exactly the income and wealth of the parents and how we get there. But, I think it's important that we do that. Otherwise, again, the gap between discourse and reality is just too much. So this is an area in which I think a lot more work should be done in the future. So now let me turn to the second point of this lecture, which is more about wealth than income. So, of course, wealth accumulation is partly the consequence of income inequality. So everything I have said about the determinants of labor income inequality, skills, education, minimum wage, corporate governance, everything is going to have an impact on the ability to save and to accumulate wealth from the different social groups. So all other things equal, higher inequality of labor income and wages will tend to lead later on to higher inequality of wealth. But there are other mechanisms which also need to be brought into the picture when we look at wealth rather than simply income. So the first point I will make is what I call in my book the return of a patrimonial or wealth-based society, which corresponds to the fact that the aggregate value, the aggregate market value of wealth, so typically real estate wealth is about half of household wealth, and the other half is business assets or financial assets, which are counterpart for capital investment in firms and companies. The aggregate value of wealth, net of debt, relative to income, these wealth-income ratios have been increasing in most rich countries in recent decades, even more so in Europe and in Japan than in the US. So the rising inequality of income is mostly in the US, but rising wealth income ratio is stronger in Europe and Japan. And part of the reason for that is that when you have slow population growth, and you have much slower population growth in Japan and big parts of Europe than in the US, then wealth accumulated in the past naturally become very important. And in the long run, this can be relevant for many more countries as we tend to go toward a slowdown of population growth pretty much everywhere. Now, this is not necessarily bad in itself, because this is partly due to aging and the fact that we need to accumulate more wealth in aging societies. But this raises new challenges. And in my book, I try to stress what I call the metamorphosis of capital, the fact that you have different form of assets, different form of regulations of property relations, different part of the legal and political systems that need to be addressed. This involves issues about worker co-determination, patent laws, and many other new issues that were not so important in the past. So let me show you a number of facts about the evolution of the aggregate value of wealth. Remember, fact number one was that income inequality had increased a lot more in the US than in Europe. Fact number two is that wealth inequality is always a lot higher than income inequality. I already referred to this above, and it is also higher than in the US. But fact number three, it is still less extreme today than it was a century ago in Europe, although the total value, the total market capitalization of private wealth relative to national income is now back to levels that are comparable to the pre-1914 economy. So let me show you a couple of graphs. So this is the share of total wealth going to the top 10%. So you can see, remember, for income, it was always between 30 and 50%. Now, for wealth, it's always between 60 and 90%. Okay, so wealth inequality is always a lot higher than income inequality. What you should have in mind is that whatever does not belong to the top 10% belongs to what I call in my book the patrimonial middle class, which I define as the middle 40%, which are in between the top 10 and the bottom 50%. So the bottom 50%, basically, they always own almost nothing. Okay? So in every country, society for which we have data, the share of wealth going to the bottom 50% is less than 5%. Okay? In the US now, it is like 2%. So very small. So whatever does not belong to the top 10 belongs to the middle 40. So when you have a decline in, say, in Europe from 90% to the top 10 in 1910 to 60% today, or 65% today, it means that now there is 30% of national wealth, or 30% of national wealth, which now belongs to the middle class, and which a century ago did not exist. So, even though wealth inequality is still very high today, this decline in wealth inequality corresponds to a very important transformation, which is the rise of a patrimonial middle class, which corresponds to a vast group in the middle of the population, which are not very rich individually, but who are not completely poor, who own typically their house, or who own, a couple of $100,000 in net wealth, which makes them, they are not very rich, but they are different from the poor. And now in recent decades, there is a tendency for a shrinking share going to the middle class. So the increase in the share going to the top 10% means that, for instance, in the US, the share going to the middle 40% used to be closer to 30%, and it's closer to 20%. So it's going down. It's still higher than what it was a century ago, but it's not going in the right direction. Well, if we believe that a prosperous middle class is important for the economic and political equilibrium of our society. So one of the big questions is, why is it so? And now, in order to understand this, it's important to distinguish between the issue of wealth inequality, how much goes to top wealth holders, the middle class, bottom, which I will address in a second, and the issue of the aggregate value of wealth. And so you can see that in Europe, there's been a gigantic U-shaped curve with the aggregate value of wealth, whereas in the US, which were less hit, of course, by World War I and World War II, the evolution, it's much less strong. You have something like a U-shaped curve, but it's not as strong. Whereas in Europe, in every European country, you take Germany, France, UK, you have different levels of wealth, but you have everywhere this strong U-shaped pattern. So like you have different levels. Like in Germany, the real estate prices are lower than in France and Britain for various reasons. Stock market prices are also different, partly because of the stakeholder model where with co-determination with workers, which is certainly not a bad thing in itself. So lower market value for capital doesn't necessarily mean lower social value for capital. So looking at the market value of capital is just one viewpoint, and in my book I distinguish with the book value of corporations and explore distinctions between the German models and other models of corporate governance. But leaving aside these interesting issues, you can see that you have the same general evolution everywhere, simply because in 1950, well, a lot of wealth had been destroyed in Europe, and also the new policy that were put in place after the Great Depression, after World War II, reduced the market value of wealth. For instance, rent control reduced the value of real estate, which was very low in 1950, 1960. Nationalization, of course, reduced the value of private wealth, or various financial regulation also reduced stock market capitalization at the time. So you have this very long-run evolution. Now, let me skip this and insist that in order to understand this long-run evolution, it's important to open the black box of wealth and distinguish between different forms of assets. So the longest time series that we have are for Britain. So you can see that agricultural land has almost disappeared. Well, it's still there, but it's not worth much. So in terms of, the value of agricultural land is now a very small part of national wealth, simply because the agricultural sector is a very small part of GDP. So in a way, there's nothing really surprising. And real estate and other domestic capital, which includes business assets, is now a lot more important. You can also see that foreign capital until World War I and until the interwar period to a lesser extent was very important in Britain and in France, which in effect own big part of their wealth in the rest of the world. And this was largely destroyed during World War I and World War II in order to finance the war, which itself destroyed another part of the capital stock. So this is a sad story, but this is the story of Europe during this time period. So you see this in Britain. You have very similar evolution for France, except that it takes more time for the agricultural sector to disappear, to shrink as a fraction of GDP, but that's basically the same general evolution. If you look at more countries and look at the recent period, and now I'm looking again at short-run evolutions. So, I told you I will sometimes take very long-run perspective with decennial averages, but the short run is also important, in particular when we think of real estate bubbles. Now, you can see that, so this is the private value of wealth expressed in years of national income in the top 8 developed economies in the world. And what you see is that, everywhere this is rising. Okay, so in 1970, private wealth. So when I say private wealth, remember about half is real estate, the other half will be financial assets and business assets. This is always net of liability. When I talk of capital income ratio or wealth income ratio, this is always net of what you have in debt. Otherwise, you can be very rich with a very large debt. So we always look at net concept. So in 1970, every country was between 2 and 3 years of national income in wealth, and in 2010, every country is between 4 and 7 years. So you clearly have a northward trend. So this is important to have in mind because, sometime in economic textbook, you hear that the ratio of wealth to income or capital to output is supposed to be constant. So, you should be careful with economic textbook. Sometime in economic textbook, when we don't have a lot of data about something, we just assume it's a constant, which, of course, if you have only one data point, everything is a constant. But when you have more data points, so this just comes from the official national balance sheets that national accounts now produce for all countries, and this is, in fact, there's no reason why it should be a constant. Even in our simplest economic model of capital accumulation, when you have capital labor substitution, any ratio of capital to output or wealth to income can be an equilibrium depending on how much you save and invest as compared to how fast is the underlying growth of the economy in terms of population growth and innovation and productivity growth. And if you move to more complicated economic model where you have a multi-sector model where the relative price of real estate, the relative stock market price also matters, then it's even more obvious that you can have different wealth to income ratio and that many things can happen. Now, this issue of real estate price and more generally capital asset prices is very important if you want to understand, for instance, look at the evolution of Japan between 1985 and 1990. Of course, this is the real estate, the famous real estate bubble of Japan in the late 1980s. Even with the Japanese saving rate, you cannot get so rich so fast. Between 1985 and 1990, they increased their wealth by 2 years of national income in just 4 years. So this will require a saving rate of 50% per year, net of depreciation, to increase your wealth so fast. So no country saves so much. So here the increase is due to an increase in the price of assets rather than an increase in the quantity of wealth. And generally speaking, over this period, you have an increase in housing prices in many countries. So you can see in the US, starting in 2007, you have a sharp decline in housing prices. But generally speaking, the level of wealth to income ratio tends to be higher in countries like Italy and Japan, partly because of the low population growth and of the high saving rate. And the money has to be invested somewhere. In many cases, it goes to domestic assets and contributes to the rising price. And another thing to have in mind is when look at the Spanish bubble in 2007, this is even bigger than the Japanese bubble of 1990. So, this has big consequences. My point here is that increase in the wealth to income ratio, this is not necessarily bad in itself. If it's due to the fact that you have aging and you accumulate more wealth, this can be a good thing to accumulate more wealth. Now, the problem is that this raises new policy issues in terms of financial regulation because, when you have a ratio of wealth to income of 600 or 700 or 800%, if you make a 10% mistake on the price of your real estate in Spain or in the US, this has huge consequences for the real economy. Whereas when the ratio was 2 to 3 years in 1970, it's sort of less important. So issues of financial regulation and capital regulation, generally speaking, are much more critical in societies with higher wealth to income ratio. And another evolution that I want to stress over the period is that you have at the same time an increase in private wealth and a decline in public wealth. So what is public wealth or public capital? This is the difference between public assets and public debt. So this is the same definition as for private wealth, the difference between private assets and private debt. So this can be negative. For instance, in Italy, you probably cannot distinguish between all countries, but the case of Italy is interesting because Italy is at the top of the class for private wealth and at the bottom of the class for public wealth. And of course, the two are related because someone has to buy the public debt and someone has to buy the privatized assets. Okay? So what happens in Italy, but in most countries over the period, Italy is just an extreme case, is that you have a general decline of public wealth because you have less public assets with privatization policies in a number of countries, and more public debt. So if you have less assets, more debt, your net wealth goes down. Now, the good news is that private wealth has increased, and has increased, in fact, more than the decline in public wealth. So it's important to have in mind because sometimes when we talk about the public debt crisis, we are completely forgetting about the other part of the national balance sheet. And, it's not that the public debt is not owned by the Mars planet. It's owned by ourselves. And so we have to look at the entire balance sheet. And in particular, you can see, in the case of Italy or other European countries, that private wealth has actually increased a lot more than the decline in public wealth. In the case of Italy, you can explain about 1/4 of the increase in in private wealth from the fact that private Italian households have bought some of the public debt and privatized assets corresponding to the decline in the public wealth of the Italian government. Now, the fact that you now have a negative public wealth in Italy means something very concrete. It means that even if the Italian government was to sell all the public assets, all the public schools, public hospitals, everything, this would not be enough to reimburse their public debt. Now, I'm not saying they should do this. I think many people will be shocked to have to pay rent to the private owners of the formerly public school and public hospital. But in a way, this is already what we are doing, because when you have a public debt that is bigger than the value of the public asset, it's a bit more abstract, but in effect, through the financial intermediation system, you can end up paying in interest payment for your public debt more than what you would pay in rent for the public building. So in the case of Italy, right now they are paying 4 to 5% of GDP in interest payment each year, as compared to a total budget for the university system of about 1% of GDP. So is this the best way to prepare for the future? It's not entirely clear. And so in the past, in particular in the post-World War II period, we see lots of examples, in particular in Europe, in particular in Germany, where public debt was restructured, was written down in effect to almost to zero, so as to be able to invest more in the future and so as to allow priority investment in public infrastructure, education. And I think this was part of the post-World War II growth success. And there's a lot of historical amnesia about this these days, but I think it's important to realize that we've already had inequality crises in the past, we've already had public debt crises in the past, and looking at the historical record in some cases can be a way to show that there are more alternatives and to open up the discussion. Let me accelerate a little bit. In my book, I also talk about other forms of ownership. Probably the most extreme form of ownership you can think of is the ownerships over human labor. And here you have this very peculiar situation in terms of private wealth when you compare in the 19th century Europe and the United States, where at the same time in northern United States, private wealth is not very important. You have a lot of land, of course, but you have so much land that the market value of land is very small. And so this is an observation that was made a long time ago. Tocqueville, writing about America in 1830, made already the point that because the value of agricultural land per acre of land is very small in North America, everybody can become a landowner, and this is why you have democracy in America, because you can have a society where everybody is part of the property system. Except that in the South, you cannot be very rich by owning the land, but if you have the good idea to own the people who work on the land, then in the end, the total aggregate value of private wealth is as high as in old Europe. So you have this contrast between sort of a part of the US which has always been, at least until the early 20th century, more egalitarian than Europe in terms of access to property, and very extreme form of inequality in the south of the country, which is, of course, something that you still see today when you look in particular at recent work gained by Saez and Chetty. They show that the degree of mobility in the US varies a lot between the south and the north of the country. So you see that throughout history, and I think that, again, it's important to put this in historical perspective. Another interesting case, which I mentioned, is the case of Germany, where you observe lower market values of capital assets in Germany, partly because of lower real estate prices. This has to do, to some extent, with the different geography of the country, to some extent, rent control policy. But even more importantly, you have lower stock market capitalization of corporations, which can be interpreted as a consequence of what is sometimes called stakeholder capitalism. So, you have 50% of board members of companies which are representative of workers. So apparently, or at least until recently, this does not prevent German companies from producing good cars, but I think generally speaking, the general point I want to make here is that there are different ways to organize property relations. And the governance of companies can be organized in different ways. In Sweden, you have 1/3 of the board members which are worker representative, and apparently this is not doing harm to Swedish companies. So in my country, in France, for a very long time, shareholders and employers were against any form of representation of workers on boards. And at the end of the day, people told them, well, look, in Germany, in Sweden, apparently the firms are actually doing better than what you are doing in France, so why don't you want to involve a little bit more the workers? And the law has started to change last year. But generally speaking, this illustrates that the market value and the social value of capital can differ, and we need to look at the legal system and the whole set of institutions through which property relations are regulated. Now, let me finally, in the last part of this talk a little bit about the future of wealth inequality. And here I will argue that one of the important determinants of the concentration of wealth in the long run is the gap between the net of tax rate of return and the growth rate of the economy. So let me immediately show you a piece of evidence which I find striking. So this is data coming from the Forbes magazine ranking of world billionaires. So this starts in 1987 because this is when Forbes magazine started to publish their data. So let me say right away that this data is not particularly reliable. We don't know very well how this ranking was done. And, it's a bit sad in a way that we have to look at magazines to learn about the wealth distribution. So we are trying to do better. And recently, Saez and Zuckman have produced a new study on wealth concentration in the US, which is consistent for the very top evolution with the Forbes rankings. But this is, an area where there's really too little transparency and too little access to high quality information. So we have to do with what we have. And so for the time being, it's interesting to look at this data. Now, usually when people look at this data, all what they do is to say, oh, okay, you have more and more billionaires every year in the world. But, after all, in a growing world economy, there's nothing very surprising that you have more and more billionaires every year. So here what I do is slightly more sophisticated, which is to take a fixed fraction of the world population each year and to look at how the average wealth of this group is changing over time. Now, if you look at the top groups, you can see that their average wealth has been rising very fast over time, 6 to 7% per year, which is 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth and average income in the world, and much faster than the size of the world economy. So the world economy has been increasing at 3.3% per year. But 1.9% is going to the rise of world population. So it's important to have in mind that, population is supposed to slow down in the 21st century, but as of now, in the world level, because of aging, it's still rising at 1.5% per year or even a bit more. So when you have a world GDP growth of 3.3, in fact, the per capita income is only rising at 1.4. Okay? Per capita wealth is rising a bit faster. That's because of the rise in the wealth-income ratio that I have shown you before. But still, it's only 2.1% per year. So the top is rising 3 to 4 times faster. Now, let me stress very clearly that these, of course, are not the same people over time. There's a lot of mobility in this group. So in 1987, the top billionaires of the world, according to Forbes, were Japanese billionaires, which everybody has forgotten their name and nobody talks about them anymore. Whereas today, in 2013 or 2015, we have new billionaires from the Silicon Valley, from California, from Mexico, from India, from all over the place. And this is very good to have all this mobility and all this new entrepreneurial wealth. This is extremely positive. But if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, in principle, this mobility effect where some people go down from the top and some people go up to the top, these two effects should more or less compensate each other, so that the average wealth at the top should increase more or less at the same speed as the average wealth in the world. In the long run, you cannot have this forever. Because if the average wealth in the top group is rising 3-4 times faster than average wealth in the world forever, this means the share of world wealth going to world billionaires will go toward 100%, which everybody would argue is probably too much. And so, I'm not saying it's going to go that far. I'm sure it will stabilize at a lower level, but where will it stabilize exactly? At what level? Nobody knows, and this can go quite far. And so it's important to have in mind that it's perfectly fine to have rich people, middle class, and lower people, but in the long run, you need to have the different groups in society which rise more or less at the same speed. Not exactly at the same speed, but you cannot have some groups rising on average at 6-7% per year when the average is rising at 1 or 2%. So how do we explain this? Just entrepreneurial mobility is not enough, because this in itself, you should have upward, downward mobility. This is not explaining why the top on average is rising faster. So what else do we have? Well, first, it's important to understand that in the top billionaires group, you don't only have, a nice entrepreneur like, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs a couple of years ago. You also have, people like Carlos Slim in Mexico. He did not invent the cell phone. He was able to benefit from the privatization of the telephone sector in Mexico in ways which many people would say, he got this thing at a relatively low price. There are more extreme examples. If you take Russian oligarchs or Middle East oligarchs, which play an important role in this world ranking of billionaires, they did not invent the oil or the gas. They just became the owner of large part of natural resources at a very low price. So this is an extreme example of the transfer from public to private assets, which I referred to earlier. So, the good news is that there's not much left to privatize, so this effect should stop at some point, but for the time being, this plays an important role. You also have inherited wealth, which is sometimes increasing as fast as new entrepreneurial wealth. And there's this famous example, which I quote in my book, of the number one billionaire in France and Europe, Liliane Bettencourt, who never worked. And her wealth between 1990 and 2010 went from 10 billions to 30 billions, which is exactly at the same speed as the increase of Bill Gates' wealth, which is, we would all like to see the wealth of Bill Gates rise faster than the inherited wealth, but sometimes, wealth is not only about merit and innovation. Sometimes, there are positions that people are able to take at some point in time, and then there's a lot of inertia in the ability to preserve position. So how do we account for this? Well, one way to better understand what's going on is to go to this other form of data which comes from university endowments, which is an issue everybody is very interested in at Stanford, I am sure. But the reason I'm showing you data from university endowments is not really to talk about university endowments, but it's just because at least these people release data. So we actually know a lot about university endowments in the US, and so we can see what kind of rate of return they get and why. Whereas the Forbes people, we don't really know anything very precise, so we cannot really distinguish between the different explanations. Now, what this is showing, so this is the average between 1980 and 2010, and I don't know why there is a French word, period, but this is a period, 1980 to 2010. So there are about 850 US universities with capital endowments. So if you look at the average return between 1980 and 2010, you can see that they have all done pretty well, 8.2%. So this is a real return, after deduction of inflation, after deduction of all administrative expenses and management fees. And you can also see that the higher the initial endowment, the better you do. So that's very interesting because, when we talk about R versus G, the rate of return versus the growth rate, I think it's really important to understand that not everybody is getting the same rate of return. Okay? So in the textbook model of capital markets, everybody should get the same rate of return. You go to your bank with $10,000 and it will get invested in China the next morning and you will get the world marginal product of capital, the best return on the planet. Now in the real world, this doesn't seem to be working this way. And clearly, higher endowments get higher returns. Now, why is it so? Well, probably partly because you have economies of scale in portfolio management. So if you take, the case of the Harvard, Yale, Princeton, I guess I should have put Stanford on this table, and I think Stanford has done even better in recent years. So consider that Stanford is even a bit higher than Harvard, Yale, Princeton in recent years. But take the example of Harvard. They get 10% on average between 1980 and 2010. How much do they spend in management fees? Well, their endowment at the end of the period is of the order of $40 billion, or maybe it has increased again, and maybe now it's more 45 or 50, I don't remember, but say of the order of 40 billion. How much do they spend in management fees? Well, they spend only 0.3% per year. But 0.3% of 40 billion is more than 100 million per year. So if you can spend 100 million each year, you can pay a good team of wealth managers. And even if these people are very costly, this is still a good team of wealth managers. Now, if this allows you to get a return of 10% rather than 8 or 6, then it's worth it. Okay? Now, if your endowment is 100 million, of course, you're not going to spend 100 million each year in management fees. Okay? And if you have $100,000, you can ask advice to your brother-in-law or something, but probably that's not going to get you very far. And so when we talk about rate of return, I think it's very important to have this in mind. It's also important to have in mind that this rate of return effect is a lot more important to explain the growth in university endowments that all the charitable giving and student giving to US universities. And I think it's important to have this in mind. I don't want to deter you from giving, but, quite the opposite. But I think, sometimes you hear very strong claims about the fact that private philanthropy is going to solve every problem, that we don't need taxation anymore, we just need to wait for billionaires to give part of their wealth. So it's important to look at numbers and to put this kind of claims under public scrutiny. And in the case of US universities, they publish data. So again, if you take the case of Harvard over this same period, on average each year, all the gifts made to Harvard universities are of the order of 0.5% of the endowment each year. So as compared to a return of 10% per year, this is almost negligible. Well, it's not entirely negligible. This is still money, and sometimes it can be useful to get your children admitted, so that's very useful. But if you want to understand quantitatively the evolution of the endowment, that's almost irrelevant. Okay? So I think it's important because sometimes you hear things which do not quite square with the numbers. Now, this rising rate of return with initial endowment, this is not necessarily bad in itself. If US universities, top US universities do very useful investment with the money, after all, that's who cares? Well, this has consequences maybe for the inequality between universities, between the bottom ones and the top ones, but if by and large, if the money is well used by universities, this is not too bad. Now, if this is also happening at the level of individual wealth, you can see that this can raise problems in the long run because this tends to contribute to a concentration of wealth at the top end and a shrinking share for the middle class, because the middle class, of course, is not getting this kind of return. It's getting right now real returns that are very small or close to zero on their financial saving. Then, in the long run, this can raise difficulties. So the best solution, ideally, you would want to have more transparency about wealth dynamics, and you would like to be able to adjust your policies, and in particular your tax policy, to whatever evolution you see. So, if we get better data, and we find that the top wealth holders are actually not rising at 6 or 8% per year and are only rising at 1 or 2% per year, I will be very happy to say that we don't need very progressive taxation of wealth at the top end. But if if this is true, and if the top wealth holders indeed rise mechanically much faster than the average, and rise at 6-8% per year, then it's difficult to argue that a 1 or 2 or 3% wealth tax is going to kill them. So I think it's important to, again, to have more transparency about wealth dynamics so that we can adjust our policies to whatever is the target. After all, you can have any target. 100% of the wealth in the long run for billionaires will be, I think, too much. But any target is, is worth discussing. I think to have a solid middle class and a good share of the wealth for the middle class, the question is not complete wealth equality. But just having a shrinking middle class in the long run, I think, is problematic. And maybe part of the reason and part of the mechanism why this is happening has to do with this. There are many other mechanisms. We've been talking about education, policy investment in education, a labor market. So there's a whole set of rules and institutions that matters, but this is certainly one of them. Now, let me conclude by saying, is this kind of progressive taxation of wealth going to happen anytime soon? Well, probably not anytime soon, but in the long run, when you look at the evolution of the tax system, you see evolutions that are not always planned in advance. So, let me conclude with so this is a brief summary of income tax in US, UK, Germany, France. So a century ago, there was no income tax, or very low tax rate, 5%. And many people thought that the income tax would never exist, in particular in this country where the Constitution made it impossible to exist. And finally, it was created in 1913. And a little after that, in 1920, the top tax rate was already above 70%. And between 1930 and 1980, in the US and in the UK, you have top tax rates which are extremely high, 80, 90%. If you take the average top income tax rate in the US between 1930 and 1980, you have 82%. So sometimes it was 91 under Roosevelt, sometimes it was 70, but on average it was 82. And this lasted for half a century. And apparently this did not destroy American capitalism. Probably because this top tax rate only applied to very, very high incomes, typically above $1 million in annual income. And, the evidence we have suggests that paying top manager $10 million rather than $1 million is not so useful. So maybe this explains why, in the end, productivity growth in the 50s, 60s, 70s, at the time of this very high top tax rate, was actually higher in the US than what we've had since the Reagan years, since the 1980s. So I know that many people are not ready for a quiet conversation about this, and it's always difficult to have a quiet conversation about taxation. People get very excited very fast, but I think it's important to remember that this is part of our common history, and I think it's time to revisit this history and see what we can conclude from there. You have the same thing with the taxation of wealth, or at least the taxation of inherited wealth, where you can see again that the US and Britain are countries which have used progressive taxation of wealth at very high levels. So again, this top inheritance tax rate of 70, 80% were applied only to very top wealth holders. But still, it's interesting to see that in France and in Germany, the tax progressivity has always been much less than in US, Britain. That's partly because the redistribution of wealth in France and Germany was done through other means, in particular destruction due to the wars, nationalization, which was not always very successful. I tend to prefer progressive taxation. I think this is a better way, by and large, to have a sort of democratic, transparent regulation of inequality. It's interesting to see that the only time that you have in Germany very high top rates, is between 1946 and 1948, which is when the tax policy of Germany was set by the Americans. No, but look, this is the same for the income tax. 1946 to 1948, you have 90%. But this is not a joke. And this is when the Allied Control Council was setting the tax policy of Germany, and in practice it was ruled by the Americans. And you have the same thing in Japan, where in 1946 to 1948, you have a 90% tax rate. And when Germany gets its sovereignty back in 1949, they quickly reduced the top tax rate to a little bit more than 50%, and they want to escape from these crazy American levels of 90%. And it's important to remember that, the US authorities were not doing this to punish Germany or Japan. They were doing the same at home. So this was not a punishment at all. In the US view of the time, this was really part of the civilization package, if you want. You bring democratic institutions, and at the same time, you bring fiscal institutions so that democracy does not become a plutocracy and you don't end up with excessive concentration of income and wealth at the top. So I know this can seem very exotic and ancient history to you, but this is part of our common legacy, and I hope I have convinced you that looking at the history of inequality of taxation can help us to better apprehend the future. So let me conclude and say that the history of income and wealth inequality is not simply an economic history. It is always deeply political, social, cultural, and this is why in my book I try also to talk about the belief system and representations of inequality in the political debate, also in the literature, because I think in the end these are these representations of inequalities that determine the change in policies, institutions, and this is what matters. So in a way, both Marx and Kuznets were wrong in the sense that Marx predicted ever-increasing inequality. Kuznets, or at least according to the Kuznets curve optimistic interpretation of Kuznets, which, as I said, Kuznets did not really believe in, according to this optimistic theory, you have a natural decline in income inequality. Well, I think both were wrong in the sense that there are powerful forces pushing in both directions, and in the end, what really matters, which one dominates, really depends on which institution and policy are set. So high gap between rate of return and growth can push toward high wealth concentration, in particular if you have very high financial return for very large portfolio, but many other forces are also important. Ideal solution, there's no magic bullet. There's ideal solution involves a combination of education, progressive taxation, social labor laws, financial transparency. There are other more authoritarian solutions out there to regulate inequality. In China and Russia, the way to regulate inequality is in a way to put a couple of billionaires in jail from time to time when it becomes. I think this is not sustainable in the long run, and I think. Progressive taxation and transparency is in the end more fair, but most importantly more efficient if we want to regulate inequality and put market forces and globalization, in which I believe very much, in the common interest and not only in the interest of small groups in our societies. So thanks a lot for your attention. And So was I too long?
No, it's good.
Yeah?
We have time for a short period of questions. Why don't we take a 30-second moment while people array themselves by the microphones if you wish to have a question, or alternatively scoot out for another event. And we'll take a question in 30 seconds.
So how long did I speak for?
About 55 minutes.
55. Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Because I lost track of your watch. I didn't
fine.
know. Yeah, you should get it back.
Okay.
So this was not too technical. No, this was okay.
No, I mean, it's an alumni crowd.
Right.
So, but they fashion.
So I was not too provocative with.
No, I thought it was good.
Yeah?
I thought it was good. Yeah, I mean, from my taste, you could have been more provocative. But
Oh, okay.
It was good.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right.
Ah, merci.
Do the audio people?
Bon, merci.
Hello? Oh, now you can hear me again. Good. All right. I see a long line. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get through all the questions. But let's begin over here. If you could state your name and keep your question short, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jung Nguyen. First, I wanted to applaud you for an amazing piece of work, and it brings out some really thought-provoking issues. Thanks for that. I do want to ask about your data sources. The Financial Times ran an article on your book a while ago, and they pointed out to what they claim is inaccuracies in your data, and they gave some striking examples, especially around wealth concentration in the UK, where they claim that your data is very different from the data from the government statistical agency. So I was wondering if you can comment on that, and also some of the solutions that you advocate, like progressive taxes and taxes on wealth. How would that affect, say, innovation and risk-taking, and could that result in capital flight? Thank you.
Right, so the Financial Times, you know, I am very grateful for all the free publicity that they have given me. I mean, they've been, you know, I think they are a bit confused because they started by claiming that all the data was wrong, and then the following year they gave me their Best Business Book of the Year award. So, I still cannot figure out, you know, well. So, you know, look, I welcome everybody who wants to participate to the task of gathering better data. In the case of wealth inequality in Britain, you know, I think there's a big problem with the official government data, which is based on self-reported survey data, and according to this survey, basically there's no one who owns more than £1 million in Britain, you know, because in self-reported survey, you know, you just have nobody at the top who's responding. And that's completely inconsistent with all other information that we have, including with the Financial Times rankings of British billionaires, which, like every ranking of billionaire in the world, is showing a very strong increase, much faster than average wealth growth in Britain. And, you know, I think you just have to go to London and look at real estate price for large properties and see that the top of the distribution of wealth is doing very well. So I think here the Financial Times should have been a bit more careful. That being said, you know, I think indeed we need to make progress in our measurement of wealth. We are trying to combine all the data sources that we can find. We put more data online almost every week. All the details about our computations are online. You know, if I was to rewrite the book today, if anything, I will conclude that there is more stronger rise in inequality in wealth concentration, in particular in the US, than what I describe in my book. In particular, the more recent study by Saez and Zuckman shows an even stronger increase in wealth concentration in the US than when I report in my book when I did not have this new data. Now, there will be other new data in the future, and let me make very clear that I have no stake in this, and my only objective is to have more access to more countries' data. The issue of financial transparency is very important, not only in rich countries, but even more so in emerging countries, or in Africa, in China, where very big part, much bigger than in the north, of financial assets are held offshore, which puts strong limits on the ability of government to conduct, an equitable tax policy. So I think that's important, not only for rich countries. Now, regarding the exact level of progressivity that we should have, again, this really depends on what we see in the underlying economic evolution. If the top wealth groups are rising at 6, 7, 8% per year, it's hard to say that 1 or 2 or 3% wealth tax rate is going to kill innovation. That's very difficult, empirically to claim. So it really depends on what we see in the data. That's why, in the end, I'm really first calling for more transparency.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your work. Are you aware of any attempts, globally or regionally, to monetize of units of avoided carbon and units of other avoided negative environmental externalities, such as to turn them into usable money, at least for groups and regions, and thereby push back against inequality, while also making a major contribution to funding at least the mitigation, if not the improvement, of our rapidly diminishing global environment? And are debt for nature swaps still occurring?
Well, I wish this was happening, but at this stage, what you have is, for instance, you have bits and pieces of carbon taxation in different countries, but that's very incomplete, and there's very little coordination between countries. You have a market for emissions quotas in different parts of the world, for instance in Europe, which is not working so well. There's a lot of volatility in the price of carbon that you get in this market, and also because of the initial emission permits were given almost for free. This is not raising the kind of revenue that you would like to have. So I believe more in carbon taxation, and if possible in progressive carbon taxation. So that's the first unit of emissions. For people who emit what's compatible for the long run, our long run future. Should be taxed less than those who emit a lot. And this is technically possible. Is this going to come from in the coming months and years? I don't know. But certainly, this is, I think, the only way. I think the issue of global warming and the issue of inequality are very related, because if we don't find an equitable way to share the burden of climate warming and adjustment to climate change, that's not going to happen. You cannot ask people who are polluting much less to pay as much or more than those who are polluting 10 times more. So we need to find a more equitable distribution of the burden.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Connor Riggs. I suppose I wanted to ask a question above the economics. There's an old joke about a job interviewer who asks an economist what 2 + 2 equals, and the economist replies, well, what do you want it to equal? So I find this analytical tool very powerful, but I wanted to get some input from you on how to use social science research to challenge political dogmas rather than become a tool for their stratification. Well, first of all, I view my work and more as the work of a social scientist than the work of an economist. I think the boundaries between economics and history and sociology are much less clear than what economists sometimes tend to pretend. And economists sometimes present their discipline as an autonomous science that has become so scientific that the rest of the world cannot understand. But I think. To a large extent, this is a big joke, and I think we all what we can do in economics and in other social sciences is to try to patiently collect data, historical data. I think theoretical models can also be useful, and I do contribute to theoretical modeling from time to time. But I think the problem is that far too often economists use very complicated mathematical models to explain very little data, or sometimes no data at all. And I think, I think it's okay to use mathematical models if you have very simple mathematical models to explain a lot of data, a lot of important facts. But to some extent, the profession is moving in this direction, but I think there's still a long way to go.
With apologies, we'll make this the last question.
Sorry, I hope it's a good enough question. My name is Dean, and you make a compelling case that inequality going down in the 20th century is an aberration, but I think there's the other aberration in the 20th century and the 19th is fossil fuel use and this dramatic growth that's possible because of that. And I know you're clearly concerned about climate change, but do you see going forward that this expectation of growth, especially in the developed world, is being used as an excuse to, not redistribute the pie, but rather than and say, the pie will keep growing. But when we think about inter-country inequality, which you don't talk about as much, I know you're very aware of it. Do you see a future in which you might have to have negative growth rates in certain places to enable the positive growth rates in places that still don't have basic needs being met? How does that growth, the 1.5% that might be possible, do you see it being possible long-term given certain environmental constraints and sort of the natural intensity of growth? And do you see that us having to actually have differential growth rates in different countries? Thank you.
It's, I wish I was able to answer this question. I think nobody knows whether this 1.5% growth rate is sustainable. Technically, it is sustainable, but we need to, for this to be sustainable, we need to invent clean sources of energy, which we don't have as of today. So now, maybe this is going to happen, maybe not. So in the meantime, I think it's extremely important, at least, to limit the damage that we have already made so far, and which are going to become even bigger. Now, regarding the differential growth rate between area, the evolution of population is, of course, very important, and this is an issue. The interaction between demography and inequality, which I talk a lot in my book, and maybe this has not been discussed as much as other issues, but I think is very important. And the fact that Africa is supposed to go, according to the United Nations projections, from 1 billion today to 4 billion at the end of the century, is, of course, has major consequences for this discussion. Now, that being said, excessive population growth can be a problem, but negative population growth can also be a problem. So when you have, in Germany or in Japan or actually in China right now, the size of each new generation that is being born, that is 30-40% smaller than the size of the generation of their parents, this is creating very strange consequences for the overall structure of society, the importance of wealth transmission from parents to children. And so, I tend to believe that, small positive population growth is better than negative population growth. Assuming, of course, we at the same time do the environmental policy and the investment in new technologies and clean form of energy, which we are not doing at this stage.
Please join me in thanking Thomas.